All right. So what we're going to begin again, you guys saw it in terms of the schedule, is this thorough investigation of the legislative branch. It will take us a little bit to unroll. Again, the test itself, there's 30 to 40% of the test. This is all they give me, by the way. They don't give me any more specifics than this. 30, 40 to 40% of the test will be on the branches. The most kind of complex of the branches, I suppose, is the legislative branch. And again, anytime you're understanding the branches, a lot of it comes down to numbers. So we've got the biggest numbers here, but we've also got some of the biggest complexities. You know, numbers mean there's more dynamics kind of going on, and we're going to have more of a leadership structure. We're going to have, you know, party will play a bigger role potentially here. When you look at the Constitution itself in Article 1, this is where we have the most detail, you know, in terms of the structure and in terms of laying out powers. So, and this is the branch that we most closely identify with. This is, you know, the branch that is a reflection of our democratic will. So we're going to have to spend a lot of time on it. And that explains, again, the density of the lecture notes and the study guide. Because it's so sprawling, I think you need to kind of have an organizational approach. You need to kind of have a constant that you keep coming back to. So what we're going to do is we're going to start by looking at the structure. We're going to look at it in a formal sense. And then, you know, as we do that, we'll get into the informal as well. For example, we'll look at formal powers, but we'll also look at informal powers. You know, we're going to look at the nature of how this branch works. The theme that you want to hold on to, I think, is the idea of the efficacy, how efficient is this branch? You know, is it well structured? And then I think a secondary question you want to hold on to is not just to think of, you know, is this efficient? Is this an appropriate kind of and well-run kind of branch? But is this appropriate relative to the other branches and, you know, the kind of intent behind government? So we're not just going to look at it in the neutral sense of is this efficient, is this effective? When we look at the structure and exercise of power, we're going to kind of ask that critical question of, is this appropriate? Not just is this effective, but is this appropriate? Okay? Some of that starts by going back once again and looking at the framers' intent. And hopefully this is quick, this is easy, this is familiar. But again, if you're going to hold on to things in May, we need to do a lot of layering and repetition. So to start with, again, you know, think back to the Constitution. Think back to that last standardized test that you guys took on federalism and how it kept coming back to, you know, what's in this, you know, what's in Article 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, right? You still had to hold on to those things. So, you know, any opportunity to kind of, you know, layer back is good. Article 1 is the legislative branch, 2, executive, 3, the judicial branch. So when we look at the framers' intent, we start with Article 1. Its placement indicates that it is the most important because it does come first. That's kind of when we think of government, what we think of first. What they establish in Article 1 is a bicameral legislature. That is hopefully almost a too obvious term to go over, as is the great compromise that got us to there, but it still bears reviewing, right? Bicameral, you hear the word two in there, like bicycle. We established this two-house system because of that conflict between large and small states. Large states want representation based on population. Small states want it based on statehood. They want equality when it comes to kind of state representation. This is threatening to divide the Constitutional Convention until we come up with a seemingly obvious but still elegant solution. The Great Compromise, the Connecticut Compromise by Richard Sherman. And what it does is it gives both sides what they want. Large states want representation based on population, fine. Here's the House of Representatives. Here's the lower house. Again, notice I'm bringing in, you know, lower house, the House of Representatives. There's all kinds of terminology that, if you were explaining this, you want to kind of bring in to show knowledge. The upper house, the Senate, is for the small states. Okay, so part of the framers' intent is to make sure that both large states and small states are kind of equally represented. When we begin to look at the powers that are laid out in Article 1, Section 8, know that what they were given is really informed by the framers' context. You know, they had expectations as English citizens. They had brought English traditions. There was the unique American experience that, the colonial experience where they, due to salutary neglect and mercantilism, were given a wide degree of latitude that led them to have enhanced expectations to rights. And also you have to bring in the context of the Articles of Confederation. When they finally did get those enhanced rights, but with no strong central government, things went awry. So all of this kind of leads them to want, the legislative branch being this robust branch with enhanced powers, as we talked about in Article 1, Section 8. We want this branch to take the leading role, but we're obviously going to have to bring in some other structures, and we're going to have to bring in some necessary checks if we're going to make it more robust. What you have to then look at, I think, is when we say robust, is what the legislative branch is kind of empowered to do. Is that consistent with what the framers want? What we see the legislative branch kind of being responsible for is an increasingly wide range of responsibilities. And you can trace a lot of these back to what's listed in Article 1, Section 8. They are definitely national policymakers. Again, what's policy, right? You have to kind of go back to these terms and make sure you're fluent in it. You guys remember? How would you define policy? You know what laws are. So what's policy? Go ahead, Nick.
Like a cumulative effort of laws and government action to address a specific national goal.
Yeah, there's an intent, and so I like the idea of cumulative. We have a goal, we have an intent, and the laws collectively are meant to achieve that intent. So it's the kind of collective intent of a series of laws and governmental actions. We forget that sometimes, right? The executive branch executes, it directs its agencies. That's part of policy. The legislative branch has institutions that it uses as well and will use to direct things. It has committees, it has watchdog groups, it has groups that are there to kind of give them advice and information. So when we talk about policy, we're not just talking about laws, we're talking about the actions, and it's the cumulative intent. When we look at our immigration policy, what's our intent? We want to provide both a pathway to citizenship, but a legal pathway, let's say. So we're looking for some sort of more open-ended approach, let's say. How would you define our immigration policy? That's, when we think of the legislative branch, they're more than passing just laws in this like linear sense. Like, this law is for one thing and one thing only. There's a bigger, broader picture there. Layer in that they're also advocates for their constituents. What's a constituent? What's a constituent? If I say, if an elected representative is saying, my constituents, Olivia, what do you think? Who are the constituents? Who are they, Brian?
People they represent.
Yeah, people they represent, the people who elected them. So again, we got to make sure that we hold on to these terms. I got to advocate for the people that are my constituents. Now that might be more, kind of local on a district level. That might be statewide. Local or regional is for the representatives. Statewide is for the senator. That's different than, the national objectives that are going on. You also have party as a factor. That is kind of a push-pull factor. Party is, we're going to see, there's a lot of mechanisms that the party has to make sure people kind of stay in line. There's also, because of the numbers, going to be a different character and tone to the chambers. The Senate has a different character than the House. Throw in there also their role as watchdog. They're the ones monitoring the other branches, the executive branch in particular. They're the ones that kind of have, watchdog kind of responsibilities, I suppose, over themselves as well. We'll get into this a little bit more, but like they'll look at the budget and make sure that money is both requested and spent in a sensible kind of fashion. And then you throw in the idea of, I've got all of these different roles, but I also, if I'm a representative, have to worry about elections every 2 years. For both, I've got to worry about raising a ungodly amount of money. The amount they have to raise is rather staggering. And they're under a pretty intense microscope. Okay? So again, you got to come back to the idea of this is the things that a representative has to juggle. Is this consistent with the framers' intent? And is it okay if it isn't? Right? Is this going to make them effective? Is this what we want the branch to do? Or are these too many kind of competing, conflicting ideas that's going to set this branch up for failure? Can you both be a national policymaker and an advocate for your constituency? Can you do all of this when party and chamber are pulling you in different directions? Can you do all of this when constantly in the back of your head you're worried about elections and raising money, and yet you're also supposed to be a watchdog? These two certainly might be pulling you in different directions. That constant need to find support from interest groups and financial support, and yet we're a watchdog group. So again, that's what I'm talking about. When I say that we've got to constantly analyze this group, not just in a neutral sense, looking at its powers on paper and leaving it at that. We want to look at how effective it is, and if we deem it, as having kind of, let's say, an effective and power, the next thing we're going to look at is it appropriate, or is this kind of skewing the balance of power between the three branches? All right. So again, effectiveness and appropriateness. That's what we'll look at as we kind of go. The first bit, again, I think it should be fairly familiar. What you need under your belt as part of your just basic fluency is the basic kind of structural differences between the two houses, right? So when we look at the formal qualifications, we're looking at Article 1, Section 2, Clause 3, and Section 3 of the Constitution. The standardized tests tend to have certain areas where they want you to be more fluent as to what's in there. And again, I think through repetition as we get close to the test, you're going to be in good shape. By and large, know that the legislative branch is Article 1. Know that Section 8 is where we get the listing of delegated powers and the necessary and proper clause. Beyond that, knowing it's Section 2 and 3, I don't see that as being as much of a requirement. What I do hope that you remember is that there are the formal qualifications and other restrictions and requirements regarding the office beyond just listing of powers, right? So when we look at the different chambers, there are differences that lead to differences in character. And again, it's always numeric, right? In the House, you're going to see slightly less rigorous requirements. You can be a little younger, you can have a little shorter tenure in terms of citizenship, and both sides need residency, all right? So 25 years old, a citizen for 7 years, and a legal resident as defined by the state in which you are running or in the state that you represent. In contrast, the Senate is 30 years old, 9 years in terms of age, and a similar residence requirement. These differences in numbers mean that this one is the more I don't want to necessarily go to the word elite, but it is the more selective of the branches, I suppose. And again, it's going to explain a little bit of the difference in character. This is a more democratic kind of base. We're going to try to have allow a broader spectrum of people to run. Here, we've only got 100 members, and we want to make sure that the 100 members are of a more kind of selective class. The numbers are going to explain differences. Citizenship requirement, again, also there's a logic to that number. We don't want to preclude people that are of an immigrant background. But in the same instance, we want to make sure that there's loyalty. And again, the numbers hopefully do both. They don't preclude, but they ensure loyalty. And we've got a little bit more rigorous requirement here. All right? That's it in terms of running. That's it. But what I've kind of indicated to you before is, when we have elections, there certainly are some informal qualifications. And it leads to the question, this is really reflective on what we expect our elected representatives to be. And again, I think it raises the question of diversity. You're going to see that they're not a particularly diverse group, and it raises the question, do you have to be female to represent female interests? Do you have to be of a particular religion to represent that religious group's interest? What we typically, see if I have it handy, I do. When I was, interning on the Hill, nothing fancy, but in college and working for a representative, mostly fetching things. This was like, the political geeks version of baseball cards. This was, oh, you love this, and who's that walked past you? And it literally is kind of a baseball card on an elected official that gives you like their date of birth, it gives you where they're from, what committees they're sitting on, certain pertinent biographical information. Lobbyists really use this because they got to know the names and the faces, right? If you flip through this, what you see is white guy, white guy, white guy, white guy, white guy, white guy. White Protestant guy, typically. White wealthy Protestant guy, typically. They're kind of fun to flip through. Now, these are older versions, and we've become more diverse, over time. But these numbers still largely hold up. I mean, I'm looking at the last time I found kind of, statistical updates, and we certainly can update these as part of an exploration later on. But what you see is typically older people. They're in their 50s, in 60s. They tend to be wealthier. It tends to be a millionaires club to be in the House and the Senate. 16% of the House members in 2004 were millionaires, and 33% of the Senate were millionaires, versus the median income at this point was like $43,000. They tend to be more educated. Now, out of all the ones to object to, this is probably the least objectionable, right? We want them to be educated, but again, the vast majority of Americans don't hold advanced degrees. That's not as typical. So what you see here is, 90% plus, of them hold bachelor's degrees. What's interesting is that means 3 in the Senate at this point didn't hold a bachelor degree. Do we elect someone who just had a high school background? Military service is also kind of, something that we look for in members, and that may explain someone without that advanced degree. Legal background, in terms of like their educational background, what most of them have is a lawyer's background, and typically is a kind of springboard into politics. So what you see is most of them having this kind of, legal background. And certainly, when we looked at it in 2004, most of them are white. 84 to 95%. When you look at the U.S. population, white is the majority, but it's hovering around 60 to 70%. Hispanic population is the largest growing group. They're around 14%. We don't quite see them evenly represented in the House and the Senate. African American is around 12%. And again, you don't quite see that. The vast majority in 2003 and 2004 were male. Women made up only 15 to 14%, depending on what chamber I'm looking at. In the U.S. population, what percentage are women? Does anybody know? Do women make up a minority, a majority? How close is it? What do you think, Jen?
Like 50%?
Yeah, they're a little more than actually. Women make up the majority. They're around 51, 52%. So that certainly is a skewed number when you bring that into effect. And women tend to live longer. So as you look at older age brackets, depends why every elderly man wants to go to an old folks home, because it's like a 10-to-1 ratio for them there. It's skewed depending on the age demographic that we're looking at. Okay, so again, it raises some questions in terms of religion. When we look at religion, the Protestant group is the majority in the United States. 33% of the world is Christian. That equals like 2.2 billion. In terms of a breakdown from there, the world population, it's about, of that 2.2 billion, about 50% are Roman Catholic or Catholic, could be, Greek Orthodox is part of that. And then about 34% is Protestant, okay? In the United States, though, the vast majority, around 70%, is Protestant, and that's what you're going to kind of see in terms of who's represented in the chamber. The other religions are, underrepresented, arguably. And then again, a final thing to look at is military service. And that used to be kind of a prerequisite. One of the litmus tests for running for office was, did you serve in Vietnam? Because Vietnam was one of the last contentious wars where many, elected officials used, arguably, their, going into, school was a way to defer. The National Guard was a way to defer. Other kind of forms of service were a way to defer. And it became kind of a contentious issue. It was did you use things that potentially are an excuse to avoid service, or did you serve, right? Because how can you lead if you didn't serve in the military? Well, what we still see is a kind of a big percentage, but it's not really a litmus test for president anymore, is it? It's an afterthought whether or not someone had service in the military when we elect presidents now. Maybe, members who have served in Iraq and Afghanistan, they might have an electoral advantage, but it's not necessarily a requirement. So it is interesting, but a sidebar kind of comment. What I mean to kind of, bring up here is this is supposed to be a democratic body, but we do see that we have some informal things that we consider to be the right background when we elect people, and it leads to a group that is not especially diverse, but is becoming more diverse. And my question is, does it matter? Again, the classic example I gave you was when women began to be more represented in government, you began to see spending for women's health care issues and research for women's health care issues all of a sudden go up. There was more money for breast cancer research and more money for cancers that are particular to women and health issues that are particular to women. It's not that men wouldn't necessarily be sympathetic to women's causes or issues, they just might not be as intuitive about it. And you can make the same case for race. This is a great example. Ferguson, again, this is why you should be reading the news and following current events. Ferguson, Missouri is a powder keg in many ways. There was the shooting of Michael Brown by a white officer, and the question is, did race play a role? Are African American males under a cloud of suspicion constantly and have to kind of act differently in front of police, and are they more likely to get shot and killed? Or conversely, is the police officer who puts his life on the line being kind of maligned and misunderstood? Well, how you answer that question depends on your context. I don't think was race a factor in the officer shooting Michael Brown? It's an important question. But what I think is more important is the idea of there are specifics and there are semantics to this case, but what the larger issue that we're realizing again is race still matters, and we don't see things the same way. If you survey people, African Americans, by and large, and I should bring up these statistics and show you, feel like there is still, bias and that race matters in the judicial system, that it matters in terms of how they're treated by police, that race matters in terms of opportunities within their communities, and whites are more likely to think that things are fine and fair and equal. Okay? Race matters. So if race matters, does it matter in the chambers as well? You know, are people more likely to see or bring a new perspective about our criminal justice system and race if they are a member of the minority group? Okay? Important questions to ask, but that's all I'm going to do is ask them. I'll let you wrestle with them. Okay. What other structural things do we have to kind of consider? Well, let's talk about, again, numbers that ought to be familiar, but again, you know, if you get asked why the House and the Senate are different, that's a potential question that you're going to get to talk about the, you know, what would make the chambers different. You know, one of the things that's going to make them different is numbers. If you're going to get asked why the executive and legislative branch are different, again, it's numbers. Don't forget that. So even though these seem like basic kind of questions that would only be in the multiple choice section, this is stuff that could be a springboard for essays as well. We have stricter requirements for the Senate. We also have a longer term. Again, it makes this group a little more selective, a little more elite, a little more independent, right? So they serve 6-year terms, and both the House and the Senate have unlimited terms. What it means is they are not constantly worried about re-election. What's interesting is we'll look at incumbency rates. You would think, you know, with 6-year kind of terms, they become kind of institutions, and certainly certain figures did. Kennedy, Kerry, those were Massachusetts Democratic kind of institutions that served near 50 years in the Senate. You know, and they seemingly are impossible to topple. But we'll talk a little bit later that even though they serve 6 years, the fact is there's 100 of them, and you only have to know 2. And if I asked you who your senators are currently, you're probably more likely to know them than the House. So you're on videotape. Who are your 2 senators? One's a female. I should swing the camera around and show you all these kind of, you know, desperate, you know, kind of looking down, taking notes, Mr. Hastings. Who? Good, Elizabeth Warren. The other is a relative newcomer because Kerry was the senator and he went to become Secretary of State. And so there was a vacancy.
Tierney?
Tierney is your representative, and he just got unseated.
Ed Markey.
Ed Markey is your other senator. You're more likely to know them because if I asked you Tierney, you'd not likely know him, and he just got unseated. Who's the new guy?
Moulton.
Yeah, but again, that's just off an election cycle, and most of you were deer in the headline, right? So they tend to be a little more high profile. For that reason, again, that's where we direct credit and blame, right? I need a face if I'm upset about something. So you're going to see, you know, the length of the term might explain a bigger degree of independence and a certain incumbency advantage. I can make a tough decision and then assume you're going to forget it. You know, I can make a ruling on immigration and then, you know that it might not be something that's going to haunt me. But at the same time, I'm a little more high profile. So if there's a wave of throw the bombs out, it's going to get directed at me. And you'll see that in kind of incumbency percentages. All right? So, long story short, there is an increased sense of independence. With 6 years, you get more expertise. You get to be, and this also has to do too with, you know, it's not just longevity, but the degree of responsibility. Both of these groups are going to have committees. The House will get to kind of focus a little bit more. You know, there's less to go around. There's 435 members, and so they don't have as many committee seats. But they also don't have the longevity of looking at these issues as much as senators do. So even though the senators have to sit on more kind of committees, they tend to develop more expertise because of the time frame that they're in. One other little nuance to consider too is We don't put up all 100 senators for reelection every 6 years. That would be dangerous as far as the framers were considered. If you had your more, specialized group, all of a sudden, the wave of anti-incumbency sentiments thrown out of office. So what they do is they stagger the elections. 1/3 come up for reelection in 2-year cycles. They're all serving 6-year terms, but they've kind of staggered those terms so that 1/3 come up for reelection every 2 years, right? So we just had a recent wave of congressional elections, but only 1/3 of the Senate was up for reelection. In the presidential cycle that happens next, 1/3 will be up for reelection there, and then the next 1/3 come up in the next kind of congressional cycle. That's to maintain some continuity. And so we would talk about the Senate as having more continuity for that reason. Disadvantage, arguably less accountable. All right, the House, it's the opposite. It's the other side of the coin. 2-year terms mean that they are constantly kind of running for election and constantly reminding you of what they do in service for you. The drawback to that is they're less, the more accountable means less independent, and it explains why the two chambers can't line up sometimes. Why they're so in opposite areas when it comes to like immigration. All right? Remind me we're on incumbency advantage. I've already kind of covered some of that, but it's there in the notes.